Welcome to Basic Science class. Very quickly before we dive into a topic of discussion today, I have a question, which is why is oxygen needed in water? Have you ever thought about it? Why do we need oxygen in the water? And most times you see that, okay, some humans, when they want to maybe visit the ocean and go deep down into the ocean to visit the coral reefs and other organisms, you see them have something like a backpack on their back, and they call it oxygen. So, and you know it's available for some times and the rest. So why is oxygen needed in water? Is it only human that need oxygen? No. Do not forget that oxygen is needed by every organism. So when I mean organism, I'm talking about plant and animal. Okay, in a way, plant does not need oxygen, they give it off, but humans or animals take in oxygen. So are there some animals in the water? Yes. So oxygen is definitely needed in water. So that will lead us to our topic today, and also it's a continuation of habitats. If you've seen the previous video, I remember I said we're going to continue this elaborately in the next video, in the next class. So we're still on the types of habitats, and in the process we've looked at aquatic habitats, and we were under factors in the previous video, factors that affect aquatic habitats. So I mentioned just one, and I said that's number one is very important, that is turbidity, in the previous video. And I said subsequently we're going to consider other factors that affect aquatic habitats. So what our focus for today's lesson? So at the end of today, you should be able to define terrestrial habitats, state the characteristics of terrestrial habitats, also state the factors that affect terrestrial habitats. So although we are under types of habitat, it seems to be like we're only considering only terrestrial habitats, but do not forget we have some depths to pay for aquatic habitat. So we're going to continue from there. So another factor that affects aquatic habitat is water depth. That is how deep the water is. The depth of the water in aquatic habitats is an important factor that affects the organisms living there. Deeper water receive less sunlight penetration. I could remember saying this in a previous class, that there are some organisms that stay deep down in water and they don't easily have access to light. Yes, that was it. So deep water receive less sunlight penetration. The deeper you go, the darker it becomes in the water, so leading to reduced photosynthesis. And there are some organisms there that need sunlight to produce their food. There are some plants that need sunlight and algae that are deep inside the water that produces their food, so they can be affected once there is no sunlight penetration. They cannot produce enough food for them to survive, and it can limit their growth. It also affects the availability of different sources such as food and shelter, as some organisms prefer shallower waters close to the surface, while others inhabit deeper regions. And the number two there is temperature. I remember saying this during the question time in our previous class, that we're going to consider temperature in detail in our subsequent class. So this is the class I was talking about. So the number two there is temperature. Water temperature varies depending on the location. So depending on the location of the water, whether it's you're at the first level or second level or whatever level you are, that means depends on how deep the water is. So that's how the temperature also varies. And also proximity to other water bodies. Temperature plays a significant role in the metabolic rates and behavior of aquatic organisms. Different species have different temperature requirements, and variations in temperature can affect their growth, reproduction, and overall physiology. The next is salinity. That is the extent of which the salt content that water consists. So salinity refers to the amount of dissolved salts in water. Aquatic habitats can have varying salinity levels, such as freshwater habitats with low salinity and marine habitats with high salinity level. organisms have different tolerance to salinity. Even humans, we have different tolerance to salinity. There's some food that you would take, you'll be like, there's no salt here, and someone else would take the food and be like, wow, I love this food, it's okay, the salt there is enough, because what we have different tolerance to salinity, and this influences their distribution and adaptation. So this salinity help to what influence their distribution across those various habitats, whether they will stay in the marine, that is the ocean, or they're going to stay in the freshwater ecosystem, based on, because freshwater ecosystem, they do not have high salinity, they have low salinity. Why the marine, the ocean, they have high salinity, very high. For example, some fish species are adapted to freshwater environment. Example of this is your catfish. You find them in your freshwater environment, while others have evolved to live in salt water. So the next is water flow. The speed and direction of water flow, such as in rivers, streams, or ocean currents, are crucial factors in aquatic habitats. When you get to some rivers, you see them there, or streams, they just flow gently, very gently, and they're just like that. But there are some water bodies you get, they are flowing very fast, like before you know it, those waters are just moving very fast. So it affects the organisms that stay in that kind of environment. Organisms that cannot survive in such fast flowing water, we have to move to habitats where there is slow, the water flow is very slow. So water flow affects the distribution of organisms by transporting them, their larvae, or their food resources. It also influences the availability of nutrients and oxygen. Faster flowing waters tend to be more oxygen rich and can support specific organisms adapted to such conditions. And the next is your nutrient availability. You know, we are still under aquatic factors that affect the aquatic habitats. So we have nutrient availability. Nutrients including nitrogen, phosphorus, and oxygen are vital for the productivity and diversity of aquatic habitats. They play a crucial role in supporting the growth of plants, algae, and other primary producers, which form the base of the aquatic food chain. Yes, I'm going to say this once again. If you have not seen ecology video, we have 3 videos under it. Please see them so that you understand. I discuss food chain there and also food web. So if the nutrients, some nutrients are not available for these producers, and they cannot produce their own food, they will be out of the environment, or they will die off, I mean to say, and then it's going to affect the food chain or the food web, and it's going to have a compact effect on the ecosystem. Nutrient availability is influenced by factors such as water quality, sedimentation, and external inputs like runoff from land. Imbalances in nutrient levels can lead to algal blooms and other ecological disturbance. And the next is dissolved oxygen. Dissolved oxygen. Oxygen availability is critical for the survival of aquatic organisms. I know our industrial question was, why is oxygen needed in water? So you can see that dissolved oxygen availability is critical for the survival of aquatic organisms. So if oxygen is not available, they will die. Survival of aquatic organisms is largely on the availability of oxygen in the water. So the amount of dissolved oxygen in water depends on various factors, including temperature, water flow. And when we're considering the water flow, I remember I said that waters that flow fast, they are oxygen rich. They are oxygen rich. And photosynthesis by aquatic plants. Aquatic organisms such as fish and invertebrates require oxygen for respiration. Aquatic organisms, animals, let me put it that way. So because plants do not, they give off oxygen actually. So aquatic organisms such as fish and invertebrates require oxygen for respiration. Without oxygen, they cannot survive. They cannot survive without oxygen. Dissolved oxygen levels can fluctuate depending on some factors too. For example, turbidity. Turbidity too has effect on the oxygen availability of oxygen in the ocean. Then how the water moves too, can also decide the amount of oxygen that the water will contain. So all this can make the oxygen levels to fluctuate. During rainy season, you see that water moves faster. They move faster, but during dry season they move more slow. So all these things too can make the oxygen levels to fluctuate, affecting the distribution and behavior of aquatic species. The next is pH level. The pH level of aquatic habitats refers to the measure of acidity or alkalinity. So we're looking at how acidic or how basic that water body is. There are some organisms in the water that can survive in acidic environments, and there are some organisms that cannot. There are some organisms in the water that can survive in basic, that's alkaline environment, and there are some organisms that cannot survive in such environments. Different organisms have specific pH tolerance. Some species thrive in more acidic conditions, while others prefer alkaline environments. Changes in pH can impact the survival, reproduction, and overall health of aquatic organisms. And the next is oxygen depletion zone. In some aquatic habitats, oxygen depletion zones can form, particularly in stagnant or polluted water bodies. I know by now you already know that oxygen is rich. You'll find oxygen in fast-moving water. So stagnant water might probably not have enough oxygen for organisms to survive. They're all polluted water bodies. So these zones have low oxygen levels due to factors like excess nutrients, organic matter decomposition, or algal blooms. The lack of oxygen in these areas can lead to the death or displacement of sensitive organisms. And I know I've said it over time that the organisms are interdependent. There's no organism that's an island, so we depend on each other. So when oxygen are not enough for some organisms, they can die, and that can also displace some sensitive organisms, like some organisms that depend on such organisms to survive. So the next is aquatic disturbance. Aquatic habitats can experience disturbance such as pollution, that is from human activity actually, sedimentation, eutrophication, that is excessive nutrient enrichment, that's what we call eutrophication. So when you have excessive nutrient enrichment or excessive nutrients being introduced into the water body, so it can lead to algal bloom, because some of those nutrients, that is what they need, and when there's algal bloom, excess algae present in the water body, it will affect the ecosystem. These disturbances can have detrimental effects on the health and balance of aquatic ecosystems, affecting the abundance and diversity of organisms. And the next is habitat complexity. Aquatic habitats vary in complexities, including features like rocks. Yes, rocks. You find rocks in some waters, logs, there are some woods inside of there, coral reefs, or submerged vegetation. These structures provide shelter, breeding sites, and food sources for various aquatic organisms. And you should know that their presence or absence in that habitat can affect the habitat. So it can affect some organisms, and that means if those organisms that are meant to stay there are not they don't find this kind of habitat, they will have to migrate to another one, to another habitat. So the presence or absence of habitat complexity can influence the diversity and abundance of species in a given aquatic habitat. So very quickly we'll move to terrestrial habitat. Terrestrial habitats refer to habitats found on land. So they're not found in the sea, they are found on land. They can be classified into various types such as forest, grassland, deserts, and tundra. So these are various types of terrestrial habitats that we have. And when we were considering ecology, there was one of the class that I spoke specifically on all this type of habitats. We looked at the forest, the grassland, desert, the kind of vegetations you have there, the kind of animals that live there, and and others. So you might need to see that video before you continue here for you to comprehend what we are talking about, because we might not go into details in this class because we've already considered that in the previous class. So what are the characteristics of terrestrial habitat? Terrestrial habitats are characterized by their soil composition, climate, and vegetation. They can vary in temperature, rainfall patterns, and seasonal variations depending on their location. So what kind of vegetation do you find in terrestrial habitats? They are home to diverse vegetations. Forests have tall trees, deciduous trees. So trees that have large canopies, you find them in the forest. They have shrubs too, and understory plants, while grassland consists mainly of grasses with scattered shrubs and trees. So in grassland you have mainly scattered shrubs and you have scattered trees, but you are going to find grasses there, more of grasses, unlike the forest that you have your trees and shrubs there. So deserts may have sparse vegetation like cacti, that's your cactus plants, and succulents, while tundra habitats have low growing shrubs, mosses, and lichens. So what kind of organism are you going to find in the terrestrial habitats? Terrestrial habitats support a wide range of organisms. Forests are home to mammals like deer, bears, and squirrels. Birds like owls and woodpeckers. On the screen, that is a woodpecker. Insects and various plant species, you find them on the terrestrial habitat. In the terrestrial habitat, that is their home. That's where they stay. They don't stay in the water, they stay in terrestrial habitat. So grassland provide habitats for herbivores. By now you should know what herbivores are if you have been following on classes. Herbivores are animals that feed on producers, and our producer here is plants. So herbivores feed on producer, they feed on green plants. So grass provide habitat for herbivores like zebras and antelopes. And yes, I just have to mention this now. If you notice, they say herbivores, and you know that herbivores, they feed on plants. And during our first class on habitat, I said that any organism will stay where they can easily get access to their necessary needs. And we said that the necessary needs are the food, water, and shelter. So it will be odd if you don't find herbivores in grassland where there are enough grasses there. It's going to be odd. It's going to be odd if you don't find herbivores there. So herbivores like zebras and antelope, as well as predators like lions and cheetahs. So you find them in your grassland. That is their habitat. And why you find them there is because they easily access their food in this habitat. Desert. So you are not surprised that you're going to find this kind of animals in the grassland because their food is there. So everyone will stay where they can get the necessary resources, such as the food and your water, and also the shelter. Deserts have adapted animals like camels, for their long legs. You understand? That's why they stay there. Scorpions. If you see scorpions, they have hard skin. So they don't lose water easily, and snakes. While tundra habitats are home to animals like polar bears, Arctic fox, and caribou. That's where you're going to find this kind of animals. So what are the factors that affect terrestrial habitats? Factors like temperature, precipitation, humidity, and sunlight affect terrestrial habitats. And you know that all these are weather conditions, and we are under climate. Climate refers to the long-term weather patterns of a particular region. So temperature, which is a weather condition, let's look at it now here. Different organisms have different temperature preference. Cold climates, for example, may limit the types of plants and animals that can survive, while warmer climates may support a more diverse range of species. So there are some species you will never find in a cold climate because they don't possess the physical conditions or characteristics that can make them to survive there. I know we looked at this during our previous class when we just introduced habitats. So some animals cannot survive in those cold environment because they will easily lose their heat, and in the process they'll be exposed to cold and they will die. But animals that survive in that place, they have force that help them to trap heat in their body and help them to survive in that environment. Precipitation, the amount and distribution of rainfall affect the availability of water and the types of plants that can grow in our habitats. By now you know that water is one of the necessity of every habitat: water, food, and shelter. So precipitation, that is the distribution of rainfall. It can affect the availability of water. In the desert now, there are lesser rainfall there. So there are some animals or plants that you will never find in the desert because they cannot survive without water. So some areas may have dry climates, resulting in adaptations like water conserving leaves or drought tolerant plants such as your cactus plants. So it has converted its leaf into spine. You see it like thorns on it. So that way it doesn't lose water easily to the environment. The next is humidity. Humidity levels can influence the growth of vegetation and affect the water balance of organisms. So the amount of humidity you have, the humidity level you have in that ecosystem, in that habitat, can influence the growth of vegetation and affect the water balance of organisms. High humidity is favorable for certain plants and animals, while low humidity may lead to adaptation like thick waxy leaves or burrowing behaviors. The next is sunlight. Don't forget that we are still under climates, and climates, as I said earlier on, it refers to the pattern of weather condition over time in a particular environment, in a particular region. So all this weather pattern, that's what we're looking at. So we still have sunlight. The amount and intensity of sunlight influence the photosynthesis process in plants, which is the basis of energy production. You know by now that plants produce their food and they need sunlight to produce their own food. So without enough sunlight, they cannot have access to the production of their food. And if they are not eating, if they are not feeding, if they are not producing their food, they are going to die. So they are going to die. The amount and intensity of sunlight influence the photosynthesis process in plants, which is the basis of energy production. And you know that plant is the least of the food chain. Plants, then that is the primary producer, that's the main producer, that's the producer, and from which other food chain, so the other consumers to get their own, either the primary consumer or the secondary or the tertiary consumer. So it's going to, if there's no availability of enough sunlight, the habitat is going to be affected. Sunlight availability also affect the behavior and activity patterns of organisms. The next is soil composition. So when we're talking about this, we have some factors that we consider when we're talking about the soil composition, like the texture, as I said earlier on, then the fertility, the nutrient it contains, and the moisture holding capacity. How long can it hold water? How long can it hold water? So we're going to look at this one after the other. First is the texture. Soil texture refers to the proportions of sand, silt, and clay particles. Different textures affect the water holding capacity and drainage characteristics of the soil. There are some soil that you pick up, they're very sharp, they're very coarse. We have fine soil, we have coarse soil. So by the time you touch this and it's coarse, you will know this is the water. It can hold water, this cannot hold water. And the next is fertility. How fertile is the soil? So what nutrient does it contain, the necessary nutrient for the plant to grow in such soil? Soil fertility refers to the presence of nutrients necessary for plant growth. Nutrients like the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are essential for the health and development of plants. Next is moisture holding capacity. Soil's ability to retain moisture affects the availability of water for plants and other organisms. I know by now you should have maybe perhaps carried out an experiment. If you have your sand, your clay, and your loam, and you pass water through it, you see that your sanded soil is coarse, so it doesn't absorb enough water, unlike your loam and your clay that is fine, when the texture is fine, so it can absorb water and can hold water for a long time. Unlike your sandy soil, by the time you pass your water through it, sandy soil absorb water quickly and pass it out very fast because it has a lot of its coarse, and water particles can easily pass through it on time. So soil's ability to retain moisture affect the availability of water for plants and other organisms. Soils with high moisture holding capacity can support vegetation in drier environments, and that's when you have your loam can absorb. It has high water holding capacity. Even your clay soil too have high moisture holding capacity, so they can help support some vegetations in drier environments. Then the next is topography. We have looked at the climate. Do not forget we're under the factors that affect terrestrial organisms. We've looked at climate and soil composition. Now we're at topography. Topography refers to the physical features of the land. So when we're talking about this, the physical feature, what you can see when you look at the land, is it slopey? Does it have elevation? Then what aspect of the slope is facing the sun, orientation towards the sun? So that's what topography is all about. So we're looking at slope. The steepness or gentleness of the land can affect water drainage and erosion. Steep slopes may lead to faster water runoff. When you have a slopey maybe land, or water runs faster, and as water runs faster there, the soil cannot absorb enough water. But where you have a gentle slope and the water runs more slow, there you see that the soil can absorb enough water that will be readily available for plants usage. The next is elevation. As elevation increases, temperature and air pressure tend to decrease, resulting in different climate conditions. You know that if you climb up onto a mountain, the place is always cold. Yes, more cooler than the normal environment. So as you go up higher, you enter into a more cooler environment, and there's some plants that cannot survive there. This influences the types of plants and animals that can survive at different elevations. And the number 3 there is aspect. That is, where is the slope facing? Is it facing the sun, or is it backing the sun? So that is the aspect of a slope determines the amount of sunlight it receives. So if you have your slope to be facing the north, the soil there is going to receive less direct sunlight, which will affect the temperature and vegetation distribution in that habitat. But if you have your slope to be facing the south, yes, you have your plants receive more sunlight, and you know that sunlight is important if a plant must survive inland environments. The next one is disturbance. That is factors that affect terrestrial habitats. We have looked at climate, we have also looked at soil composition, we have looked at topography. Now we are looking at disturbances. So natural disturbances like wildfires, floods, and storms play a crucial role in shaping terrestrial habitats. So they can create new habitats or disrupt existing ones. Where there is wildfire or flood happens, or there's a storm that just came into play, you see that it is going to displace some organisms living in that habitat or bring in new one into that habitat. There's a disturbance in that habitat. And also, that is just natural disturbance, but there are human activities too, like deforestation and land development, that is urbanization, that can also cause disturbance that can significantly impact habitats and lead to either habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. And all these, they have effects on organisms that stays in such habitats. And the last we have here is availability of resources. Also affect terrestrial habitats. We have mentioned other factors. We have looked at other factors. We started from climate, and we moved on to soil composition. Then we move on to topography, then disturbances, whether it's natural or human caused. And now we're looking at availability of resources. Availability of food, water, shelter, and suitable nesting or breeding site is essential for the survival and distribution of organisms in a terrestrial habitat. So competition for limited resources can influence the distribution and interactions among organisms. So if there is limited resources that is available, limited food available for organisms in such habitats, limited water available, limited shelter, it's going to lead to competition. And in the process, some organisms will be lost. Will be lost in the process, and maybe new one will come into place. So organisms have adaptations and behaviors to acquire and utilize available resources efficiently, such as specialized feeding structures or territorial behaviors. So today we have looked at types of habitat, and I said specifically that is the continuation of our previous class that we started in habitat. And types of habitat, we have the aquatic, the terrestrial, and the arboreal, and which we didn't cover in this video. So our next video is going to be on arboreal habitats. But very quickly, I want us to look at least one or two questions relating to what we've just learned now, to know if we truly understood what we have been taught, or you were just watching all along. And do not forget, I'm not going to answer everything. I'll just answer one or two, and I'll leave you to attempt the rest. This is how you're going to know if you truly understand, and you can do it, you can face it in a real life situation. So let's look at it. Do not forget that topic is habitat, and it's also you can also put your ecology there to get some questions along. So very quickly, I'm clicking on it to check for a question in which we can attempt here. Okay, the following are types of terrestrial habitat except. The following are types of terrestrial habitat except. We have A, forest. We have B, arid land. Arid land, I mean to say. C, marine. D, grassland. E, savanna. I can almost imagine you screaming when I mention marine. No. Marine is not part of the terrestrial habitat. You should know by now that forest is a terrestrial habitat. Arid land, that is cold regions, they are part of what they are terrestrial habitats. Grassland, savanna. Arid land, I mean to say deserts, not Arctic. Arctic are cold environments, so I'm sorry about that. Then grassland is a terrestrial habitat. Savanna is a terrestrial habitat. So the only option here that is odd in this is the marine habitat. Marine habitat is not a terrestrial habitat. It is what? An aquatic habitat. It is an aquatic habitat. So the right answer there is marine. It is not a type of terrestrial habitat. So I expect you to attempt other questions and see if you can actually face real life situation. See you in the next class. Thank you.